there, it's Silver. This is Sker Ritual. So this actually takes place in the same sort of universe as one of this developer's other games, Made of Sker, although it's a completely different game because Made of Sker is actually a sort of first-person survival horror adventure game kind of hybrid, whereas this is basically what you would get if you combined something like Killing Floor with the CoD Zombies game modes. So basically this is a horde shooter, but it's got an objective focus where every map has a linear series of specific objectives that you're expected to complete, but at the same time as this, it's constantly spawning wave after wave of enemies that gets harder and harder as you go through the level. Now, if you want to, you can just forego the objectives entirely and just do the horde shooting bit if you want to. The game even mentions this in the loading screens and stuff. It's like, yeah, if you want to, you don't actually have to do the objectives every time. You can just see how long you can survive. But if you want to actually beat the maps, they all have an objective focus, so there are things that you need to do. The way it works is pretty simple, especially recognizable if you've played a Call of Duty Zombies map of any kind before. You've got a pretty good sized map, most of which will be locked off at first. You will start in kind of a central chamber somewhere, and most of the doors need some currency to open. You can't just open them. And you gain currency by killing enemies. You'll also only start off with a basic pistol, but there will be lots of other weapons around the place that you can find, and these will also take currency in order for you to purchase and have. So pretty much the entire game is based around the horde shooting aspect being fuel for your adventure. As you kill enemies, eventually you will defeat an entire wave, and then after a certain number of seconds, the next wave will spawn. And every time this happens, the waves get larger and larger, and they'll start to have more advanced enemies in them. So actually killing all the enemies really fast isn't always the way to go, depending on what you're doing, because you may want to actually leave a few alive and extend this wave out as long as you can while exploring or completing objectives or opening doors or something like that, and not constantly be spawning new waves too fast, because they're each going to be more difficult, so you don't necessarily want to burn through like 10 waves before you've even done one objective. But you still need to burn through some waves because you're going to need all of that currency to actually explore, get yourself new weapons, open up new parts of the map, and to do various things. And you'll also find that all of the objectives that you have to complete are going to be very widely spread across the whole map, so you are going to have to open the whole thing up if you want to actually complete them all. But there are also a couple of other things to help you. For instance, you've got the perks, which are injections that are actually on the wall that you pay for, 2,500 a piece, that will allow you to get some sort of extra benefit. They are always in the same places, they're not randomly generated or anything, so once you know where they are, you can return to them, and you can only get each perk once in a single run. There's an extra maximum health, extra movement speed, extra reload speed, things like that can just improve your character overall. One kind of unique mechanic that this game uses that I don't think the Zombies game modes use, although I haven't played one of those in a long time, but it's sort of like a bit of a roguelite-y element in the sense that you get these things called miracles every now and then. Every certain number of waves you get a miracle, and these are personal upgrades that last for that run. And you have different capabilities as a character, and the miracles sort of modify each of these. So you have a healing tonic that heals you a burst of health when you drink it. You've got a Molotov cocktail that you can throw into crowds of enemies. You've got an ultimate, which at first starts off as just sort of a damaging pulse that doesn't really do much. And you've got a quick knife melee attack that is deceptively damaging and only gets stronger as you go. And the point of the miracles is to modify these and make them stronger in various ways. There are different slots, one for each of those pieces of gear, and there are lots of different miracles that can possibly happen that can modify them. So you may get one that causes your Molotov cocktail to shoot out lightning that stuns enemies and does extra damage, or you might get one that attaches to all your weapons and causes them to deal poison damage, so you can apply damage over time to enemies as you hit them. You can also get augments for that ultimate attack that make it a lot more useful. So instead of simply being a damaging pulse, it can do all sorts of things, like drastically up all of your stats for a short time, or give you like a big sort of healing aura and things like that. And there are also 3 passive slots that aren't attached to any of those abilities that I mentioned and are just sort of on their own. And there are other miracles that can go into these slots as well. Things like a damage shield that decreases all damage you take by a certain amount and reflects some of it back to attackers. That's a really useful one to get. And all of these miracles also have rarities. And there's, of course, a chance that a higher rarity one will just appear randomly. But also, if you've chosen a miracle, sometimes the higher rarity version of that will appear the next time you get one so that you can up its rarity and continue to make it more powerful. Higher rarity miracles do the same thing, but much stronger, and they go all the way up to legendary. They also tend to improve the slot that they're in. So if you have a rare rarity melee miracle versus a legendary rarity melee miracle, it won't only make it stronger, but it'll also just make your melee attack do more damage by default as well. You also have these things called revive tokens, and they're exactly what you think. If you're playing co-op, then you have a chance to revive fallen teammates just by going up to them. But if it takes too long, or if you're playing solo and you die, you can go into this sort of spectral form, find one of the respawn chambers, and use a token to respawn yourself and continue the match. But you can only carry one of these tokens at a time, and there are rare machines that you can find, and you got to spend a bunch of currency at once, and you can buy tokens from those machines, but you definitely want to memorize where they are because they're pretty rare. The weapons are, of course, also important. You have 2 different weapon slots, and the pistol you start with is pretty good at first. It will be able to one-shot enemies as long as you headshot them with it, but of course, as you go through the waves, enemies will get more and more health, and your piddly pistol damage will be less and less effective. But you'll find these sort of creepy animatronic officer things that have some weapons around them for sale, as well as sometimes some sort of lit up wooden boxes on walls and stuff that have weapons in them. And you can spend some of your currency to get weapons here. You can have 2 weapons of any kind, by the way. Your 2 slots are not limited. You don't have to have like a pistol and something else or anything like that. You can have 2 of whatever you want, including melee weapons, some of which are actually quite powerful. You can also find a doghouse, and sometimes one of these doghouses will have a dog out in front of it named Lucky that you can give some currency to, and Lucky will give you a random weapon. It could be something really crappy like a baseball bat, or it could be a really powerful rifle or something. It's just completely random every time. So that's also very much like a CoD Zombies thing where you had those random crates. It's basically that. But one other cool feature about this is the weapons that you actually get are not their final form. They can actually be upgraded each up to 5 times. And you will find this weapon upgrade machine. There's only one on every map, so you want to memorize where it is. But you can pay an increasingly massive amount of currency to upgrade whatever weapons you want. Just plop one into it, and it will immediately spit it back out at you, upgraded by 1 step. One really cool thing they've done is make the guns, the model, reflect the upgrade, so the weapon changes in appearance for every step, all the way up to level 5, which will cause it to glow brightly and have some really cool stuff on it. Basically, they start out as pretty normal looking weapons, but they get progressively more steampunk looking as you go. And then eventually they get a little bit more like sort of horror Dr. Frankenstein-ish appearance with lots of glowy bits and vacuum tubes and stuff attached to them. It's pretty cool looking. I really like the way that they've changed all of the weapon models to have these different effects. And you really want to upgrade them because once you get into the later waves, enemies will have a lot of health and there will be a lot of them. So you need the extra damage that upgrading your weapons gives you. As for the map and objective quality, it's pretty high in my opinion. There are currently 4 maps and they're quite large, like there's a lot to them. Pretty much all of them have an above ground and underground element, so there's a lot of exploration to do. And the objectives are highly varied. You'll find all sorts of objectives in these maps, some of which are pretty straightforward, like just open up this chamber, defeat some enemies while standing here until the bar fills and you're done. But some of them are a lot more obscure than that, like you have to explore the entire map finding very specific items and then bring all the items together somewhere else and then teleport to a different area and use some sort of lever, or maybe you have to use a lantern to find these glowy symbols on certain portraits around the area and then input those symbols in the correct order on some sort of puzzle lock to complete the next objective, things like that. There's a lot to do, and they've made the objectives pretty unique to each map, so each one has kind of its own theme, and as well as a lot of the enemies you'll face are just like normal fodder enemies, but there are map-specific enemies as well, like the first map having the explosive fire guys, but the second map having the lightning-throwing dudes. And I've also noticed one thing that the objectives like to do is give you a weapon that you have to use. This makes it to where you have to use one of your weapon slots on an objective-based weapon instead of two that you want. You've got one that you want and one that you have to have, one that you need. To be fair, a lot of the weapons that it makes you use are actually really good as well, but you do need certain weapons for some different objectives. Like one of them gives you a sort of lightning gun that is just really powerful on its own, although its ammo is pretty limited, but you also need it to shock these metallic scarecrows into creating a big chain lightning effect that opens up a new area. The sewers map has this sort of cluster grenade pistol that can be used to clear out these evil rats with glowing purple eyes, and also it can be used to destroy these sort of shielded weird growth things that cause these vines. Well, they're not really vines exactly, they're sort of like weird veins and fleshy bits that grow over passages and prevent you from passing through. So you need this weapon to actually get through those areas, but it's also just a pretty good weapon in general, being like a sort of ranged cluster grenade launcher pistol thing. So I'd say there's quite a lot of variety in terms of map objectives, and it also helps that the maps are really nicely themed. They all have some good music and some really nice atmosphere to them, being, you know, everything is of course spooky horror themed, but the exact version of spooky horror is a little bit different. The first map is a little bit Resident Evil 7-y, whereas the second map is a lot more claustrophobic and in the halls of a hotel. And the third map being a lot of sewers and areas above those sewers, including a big train station area and stuff. There's a lot to look at, and the final map is actually a castle, so there's a pretty significant variety of chambers and stuff to go through there. There's also a really good sense of mystery in the maps, because you'll often come across stuff that you don't know what it does yet, but you know you'll probably be back there later for some sort of objective. This happens many times throughout the maps, and it's pretty important oftentimes actually, because you need to remember where some of this stuff is, because you'll have to find it later, sometimes with a time limit and stuff. So it's important to learn how to navigate these maps and where all the weird, mysterious bits are. But there's also a lot of secret stuff, you know, secret walls, little collectible things, documents, these weird little statuette things that you can destroy that sort of glow at the right angle. And there's a lot of Easter eggs and things too in each map. So it's pretty cool how they've managed to cram a lot of sort of a sense of mystery into each of these maps and make them all a bit unique in terms of atmosphere while all being spooky. The atmosphere in general is probably one of the game's best points. I would say it does a good job with that. In terms of stuff I'm not as much of a fan of, or complaints-wise, I do have a couple. One, the movement feels kind of weird sometimes, mostly because it's easy to get stuck on stuff that you can't see. Especially if you're moving around lots of lower walls and stuff like that, like say in a hotel lobby or other places. Any sort of claustrophobic area, you sometimes just stop moving all of a sudden and have to kind of jiggle yourself around to start moving again. It's a little bit weird, and it mostly only happens in those really narrow, confined areas, but there's definitely something going on with the movement in those bits that makes it easy to sort of, I don't know, stub your toe or something. You get like stuck on nothing. There's also some of the weapon sounds are a little bit weak. I know this is always a difficult thing to do. Getting really high quality weapon sounds can sometimes be extremely expensive for an FPS, so I know that it's not always feasible to do that. But some of them sound pretty good, and others are just kind of weak sounding, so I think that the weapons are a bit of a mixed bag. I think overall the shooting in this game feels pretty good. It doesn't feel as meaty as something like Killing Floor, but it still feels pretty good. But yeah, the weapon sounds do sometimes let a couple of them down. I also think that the AI can be a bit weird at times. Now, whenever you're doing like a Horde shooter, you expect that the AI is going to be a little bit wonky sometimes, just because there are so many of them on screen at once, that occasionally one of them might get stuck on a wall, or one of them might get stuck in a doorway, or something like that. That kind of thing doesn't really bother me in a Horde shooter, because it's pretty normal, it's pretty standard, and for the most part, when that happens in this game, it's very temporary and not much of a big deal, so that doesn't really bother me much. What is the issue, though, is whenever you have an NPC that follows you, it's kind of weird. There are a couple of objectives in some of the maps where you have to escort an NPC somewhere. Now, luckily, the NPC can't die, so you don't have to worry about defending it, but it is supposed to follow you. However, sometimes it kind of doesn't, or gets stuck. There's one particularly egregious section in the hotel level where you have to lead lambs, cloned lambs, around a maze. And they have a hard time following you throughout this really confusing labyrinth. So the fact that you've got to lead 4 of them to the same chamber at the end after you find the chamber yourself, which is quite the task because it's a labyrinth. But yeah, this section is more frustrating than it needs to be because you often find yourself just sort of backtracking through various parts of the labyrinth to try and find these lambs because they've sort of wandered off on their own and stopped following you. The only other complaint I have, I think, is the mini-boss balance for solo play. I feel like every certain number of waves, a mini-boss will spawn. It's dependent on the map. Each one is different. And these guys are really dangerous. They're quite challenging to face, and they're very powerful. But it also doesn't seem like their health has been reduced for solo play. It seems like they are just as dangerous in solo as they are for a whole group, which means that if you're fighting them solo, it's really hard to down them because they have so much health. It takes like all of your resources just to get rid of them, but of course you're doing this at the same time as waves of enemies are also spawning. And there are also random events that can happen during a wave where a certain machine somewhere will start to do something, and if you don't destroy it in time, it will do things like empower the enemies until the end of the wave or spawn a big abomination mini-boss. And if an abomination spawns on the same wave as one of the story mini-bosses spawns, then you're just about screwed as a solo player because both of those do huge amounts of damage and take a lot of punishment to take down. So dealing with the objective, waves of enemies, a mini-boss, and a second mini-boss all at the same time is really, really hard for a solo player. There's also a bit of an annoying fact that if you die to the final boss of an area, but you have a revive token and bring yourself back, the boss heals itself all the way back up to full as soon as you revive, which seems kind of unfair for a solo player. But other than that, the fact that sometimes the balance is a little bit screwy if you're playing solo, it is a really fun game. I think it's got some pretty solid shooting and some really fun map design, and its overall objective design and its atmosphere are both really high points for it that make it a pretty memorable time. And it's just cool to see someone else doing this formula because the whole CoD Zombies formula is relatively unique to it. And combining it with some other recognizable genre leaders like Killing Floor, or maybe Left 4 Dead a little bit here and there too, that's quite a lot of cool inspirations to take from. So I think that there's a lot here to enjoy, and honestly, I'd say for its price, it's got a pretty good amount of content on offer. It's not that expensive, and I think there's definitely more than enough here to justify what it's asking. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Sker Ritual if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.